I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. All right, everyone. Well, welcome back to this ongoing Merkavah seminar, which is really, we're now beginning our sort of final descent into the end of the seminar. We only have two sessions after this one, excluding what is now becoming the famous lost session, which Google has eaten somehow, and which I may have to re-record. So we'll see about that. But at any rate, what we're going to begin to do now is unfortunately sort of skip over this section. If you're watching this on YouTube, we're going to be skipping over the section where we talk about some of the goals of the Merkavah mysticism, because unfortunately that lecture has been, to at least to this point, lost. And we're going to be zooming in specifically on two macroforms that are probably distinct documents that are not part of the Merkavah mysticism. Now, that's a strange thing to say, because the way that we have them, we're talking here about the Sar Torah and the Merkavah and the Shi'ur Qomah literature, is that what we have in this literature are two kinds of Merkavah mysticism that have been attached in many ways to this literature, and from a point of view of praxis, in fact, the Sar Torah literature may undergird the praxis of Merkavah mysticism in general. So we can see in the Merkavah mysticism there is a descent literature, there is the Sar Torah literature, and there is the Shi'ur Qomah literature. And those three strands, and there may be more strands, and there probably are more strands in there, but those three are certainly distinct. And I thought they deserved special attention, and so we will turn to them today. So aside from the goal of the Merkavah mysticism specifically, which is, of course, to see the throne of God, the chariot throne of God, and to witness the king in his beauty, one of the other core expectations that one is to get in terms of achievement, having done the Merkavah mysticism, is to achieve what the text calls Shi'ur Qomah. This is to say secrets of wisdom. These Shi'ur Qomah. And the question is, what exactly are these Shi'ur Qomah? And one of the examples of the Shi'ur Qomah, and this is going to set a kind of tension up in the literature, is that one is to gain certain kinds of exoteric and esoteric knowledge. But this is a kind of contradiction that we've already noticed, as some people have already pointed it out, that on the one hand, some of the literature seems to require you to have a very high level of Torah knowledge, even to qualify for the descent praxis. And yet, one of the things that one is supposed to acquire is knowledge of the Torah. So we have a kind of chicken and egg problem. Are we getting knowledge from this praxis, or do we have to have knowledge to do the praxis? And the text seems to say both. And the reason why I think the text says both is because what we're actually seeing here are two distinct forms of mysticism. One might even say one form of mysticism and one form of magic, but two distinct kinds of praxes that have been edited together into one text. And the one side of that paradox is the paradox around one achieving knowledge of the Torah and other rabbinical issues, as we'll see in a moment, but achieving that knowledge. And what's interesting about this form of magic or mysticism is that rather than making a descent into the chariot or into the world of the Hekhalot and then getting access to it via angels or whatever, you summon an angel to you. So in some sense, it's the exact opposite of a descent. You are actually getting the angel to come to you. You are not going into the angelic realms. So in many ways, this is just a straightforward, it's quite surprising difference that's sort of sitting on the surface of the text. And if we look at the text in I think a relatively deep way, we'll realize these two forms of mysticism, these two forms of magic are not congruent. They stand at odds with each other, right? There's some paradox here. And again, we've been relishing in paradoxes throughout this entire course. And as I've said before, paradoxes in mysticism are often very productive, and I think this is just another one of them. But this literature is typically referred to as the Sar Torah praxis, or the Sar Torah literature, and it's typically appended to the very end of Hekhalot Rabbati, although there are small instances of Sar Torah literature spread throughout the Hekhalot literature in general. But at the heart of the literature, at the heart of the Sar Torah literature, is a means by which one summons an angel. Sar Torah just means the prince of the Torah. You summon this angel, and that angel somehow induces in you both exoteric and esoteric knowledge for the summoner of that angel. So again, we're summoning in an angel in this literature, as opposed to traveling into the world of the Hekhalot and getting that information from the journey itself. But as I mentioned, the Sar Torah literature is mostly known through being appended to Hekhalot Rabbati, and it falls at synopsis 281 to 306. So it's not a very long text. As far as a macroform goes, it's not a significant enough macroform to count as its own text. So it's only there from synopsis 281 to 306, but it is composed of two distinct literary sections. The first section is the narrative section. The second section is the praxis section. All right, so two distinct things, but they're both introduced by Merkavah heroes. So the text is including Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Eliezer, people that we already know. These are guys that we know very, very well at this point. It's interesting to me that for some of you who aren't sort of immersed in the world of the Talmud, these will be the big rabbis that you know, as opposed to other much more famous rabbis like Rabbi, I don't know, Yochanan ben Zakkai. But it's funny that most people from this course are going to go, yeah, I know Rabbi Eliezer. Like most people don't really talk about him that much. But at any rate, we have our big Hekhalot heroes, and what we get is a relatively strange announcement in the text. And that announcement is that the true power of the Torah has not been fully fulfilled until the Second Temple period. Now, that should stand, for folks who know some rabbinical literature, that is a very unusual statement, because generally the rabbinical literature casts a bit of aspersion on the Second Temple. As you know, the Second Temple was did not, inside the Holy of Holies, it did not have the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore it did not have the jar of manna. It didn't have the staff of Aaron. It didn't have the broken tablets. So it was just an empty room. And even in the rabbinical literature, it even says that the Shekhinah never really descended on the Second Temple, that the Second Temple was less in holiness. And that as time has gone forward since Moses, Israelites, Jews have forgotten Torah. And so there's an idea that as we've gone forward in time since the days of Moses, that there has been a general weakening of the power of Torah in the world in general. The Sar Torah literature, however, says something very strange, and that is to say that the true power of the Torah has not been really unleashed upon the world until the Second Temple period. And as we'll see in just a minute, the true power of the Torah is going to be identified as the ability to summon the Sar Torah. That's going to be what it's this text is self-referential. It's saying the revelation of the Torah on Sinai was still not powerful compared to what is going to be revealed via the Sar Torah, which is I think you'll agree with me, a relatively bold claim, right? It's a relatively bold claim that this book is somehow not only equal in stature to the Torah, but in some sense represents the true power of the Torah, which is quite shocking. So at any rate, let's turn to the section on the narrative section that actually opens up the text. So what we have is, this is the time period after the Babylonian exile, when the Judeans are living in the land of Israel, and they are, as the text puts it, they are put to two different tasks that are too difficult for them. The first task is that they have to study Torah, and they have to study Torah all the time. There's kind of like, we need to be studying Torah at all times. And yet at the same time, after the destruction of Judea by Nebuchadnezzar II, they're also having to do the very boring real world stacking blocks on top of each other, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, rebuilding Jewish life physically in Judea. And their argument is they cry out to God and say, look, God, it's too difficult to make us both do physical labor rebuilding this and study the Torah all the time. We can't do both. Now, what you would think is they would say, hey, can't you get some demons to come build all the stuff for us? That would have been the other way the story could have gone. And there's like great precedents for it having gone that way in things like the Testament of Solomon. But rather than them ask, hey, can we get some angelic contractors to come down here, or demonic contractors to come down here and build all this stuff back up? What they say is, hey, can you just give us all the Torah without having to do any studying? So that's what they actually propose. They choose manual labor in some sense over studying the Torah. And in this way, this text is a very un-Jewish text in that way, right? I don't know any yeshiva booker who's going to be like, yeah, I want to go stack bricks as opposed to studying the Torah. I think most yeshiva booker are they're going to be in the yeshiva, not out there working in the contract yard. But at any rate, the Israelites say, the Judeans say, God, please just teach us the Torah already in one go, and so we don't have to do all this work of studying all the time. And God basically says, in God's compassion, sure, right? I will send you the Sar Torah, and I will send you what the text calls a seal and a crown. And what you will achieve through this seal and a crown, it sometimes refers to as a raz, as a mystery, that you'll get this raz, this mystery, you'll get this seal, and you'll get this crown, and you will acquire what the text has in the translation of Davila, which I think is a beautiful translation, an abundance of Torah and a tumult of Talmud, right? Abundance of Torah. Now, what's funny, again, by the way, the temporality of this. Think about when this story is allegedly taking place. This is taking place in the days of like Ezra and Nehemiah. The Talmud isn't even remotely on the agenda, right? The Talmud is centuries away in terms of being developed. But again, the temporality of the rabbis is always a temporality. There's no early and late, that the revelation of the Torah is ongoing, and the Talmud in some sense already exists in utero, and therefore they can receive this abundance of Torah and this tumult of Talmud. But, and then this is where, again, the text does connect in some ways to the Merkavah literature. The angels are not happy about this. The angels make the argument, specifically the Kategor Gadol, the chief prosecuting angel. You might expect the word to be Satan there, right? You expect this to be the Hasatan, the prosecutor that we see in the book of Job, but it's not. The text actually uses a Greek word, right? Kategor is actually a Greek word for prosecuting attorney. So it's the Kategor Gadol, the prosecuting attorney, and the chief prosecutor of the divine court says to God, absolutely don't do that, because if you give it to them and they don't earn it without toil, then they're not going to appreciate it. They're going to take it for granted. So they need to earn it through work, right? You can't let them just have this mystery and learn all this stuff. Otherwise, they're not going to take it seriously. And therefore, they have not earned what the text calls the crown of the divine. Again, the Torah, the crown of the Torah is conceived as the crown, the divine crown. So God basically says, don't pester me. That's what the Davila's translation has. Stop pestering me about this. Don't pester me about this anymore. And he says, I'm going to give Israel, they have merited this raz, this mystery, and I'm going to reveal to them this. In fact, I'm going to reveal them something that has not been revealed to humankind up till that point. So again, the mystery of the text, right? The Sar Torah is referring to itself internally as, in some sense, a mystery that has hitherto not been revealed to mankind. So it has a very high opinion of itself, as you can see. So thus, what we have is a kind of second Sinai, where we have this first revelation of the Torah to Moses. Now we're going to get this second revelation, the second Sinai, but it's going to occur to Israel, to Judah, and it's going to occur in the form of the revelation by the Sar Torah. So this, again, really is, I think this text is one of those texts where you can read it very quickly, and I think underappreciate just how theologically daring it is and just how theologically brazen it is, where the angels are disagreeing when God rebukes them and says, do it. And not only that, but in some sense, it is a kind of second Sinai, but a kind of second Sinai achieved through magical means, as we'll see. So the text then transitions into the revelation of the Sar Torah, and what we have is the people that are there in the attendance, and you get the sense that where this is taking place is it's taking place sort of in the construction zone of the temple, that they're building the temple, and all of a sudden they're given a vision of the heavenly temple. They're sort of transported in some way, either through a vision or through some other means, and they're given a vision of the heavenly temple. They're shown the divine throne, and they're shown a vision of the Shekhinah. So again, here we have an intersection with the Merkavah literature more generally, because part of the revelation is that they are seeing the divine throne and they are seeing the Shekhinah, the presence of God in the world. And this just knocks everybody down. Literally everyone is knocked to the floor. And I wouldn't be surprised if it would knock me to the floor too if I were just suddenly on a construction site and now I'm literally in heaven, seeing the throne of God. Be careful what you wish for. And so they're all knocked to the floor until God tells them, hey, stand up and receive the revelation that I'm about to give you. Right? So stand up. And again, this is sort of Sinai again. Stand up. I'm going to give you the power of the Sar Torah. And of course, the only person capable of standing up is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, as you probably know, is the leader of he's the exilarch. He's sort of the leader of the community returning from exile. And he communicates from God to the people as, like he says, as a translator. In the text, the way the text has it is, he explicated the names of the Sar Torah one by one by his name, by the name of his crown, and by the name of his seal. And again, this language should already be pretty familiar to you because that's the language of Hekhalot Zutarti, right? The seal and crown, that's the core conception, right? Remember, that's the means by which one enters into the seventh Hechal, the great seal and fearsome crown. That language is already to be found here in the Sar Torah, although in this case, Zerubbabel is explicating the nature of the Sar Torah to the, I guess, scribes who are now writing it down. Then we get the praxis, right? So we get this narrative introduction, and now comes the praxis. And this should all be very familiar to all of you at this point, right? What is the praxis? You have to isolate yourself for 12 days in an upper room. You have to undergo ritual immersions every day. You have to undergo sexual retention. You have to fast. You're only allowed to eat bread made by yourself. You're only allowed to drink pure water, and you have to avoid vegetables. Now, you've all heard this all before because, as you probably know, that's almost identical to the Sar Torah praxis. In fact, the evidence is pretty clear that this magical praxis for summoning the Sar Torah was retooled as part of the Merkavah Mysticism. So what we might even have, right, and Schaeffer kind of hints at this, is that the Merkavah Mysticism may have always just been descent literature, just narratives describing the descent. And what has to go on, right, is what's happened here is that this Sar Torah mysticism has been retooled to basically actionize the Merkavah Mysticism. So what may have happened here is that the descent literature began as just literature, and then it was activated. And it was activated by retooling the Sar Torah praxis in order to achieve the Merkavah descent. And we'll see there's a good reason for that in just a moment. So what we have, right, is all of this ritual abstentions. And then we have a text called the Midrash of the Sar Torah, which is inserted into the thrice daily prayers. So even the Jewish prayer cycle is injected with a new prayer, right? It's injected with a new prayer. We could have done the Sar Torah during COVID when everyone was baking bread by themselves and in isolation. It'd been a good time to get your Sar Torah on. But at any rate, we have to include the Midrash of the Sar Torah into our thrice daily prayers. And then it says that you are to continue praying in such a way that you do not cease. In addition to this, one is required to stand upon one's bed and do 12 adjurations for 13 angelic princes, which have to be sealed with either the names of other angels, with a great seal, with a holy name, and with a fearsome crown. So again, we have this idea that you need to be able to seal these angels, and all the angel names, by the way, are all nomina barbara. That's not really clear what they mean. But at any rate, we're even told that 2 of these angel names, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. I mean, one could guess it's something like Azbug, maybe the name Azbug. It's not clear what exactly this name is.
The other one, it's maybe Sortak. Again, how to pronounce these names is not at all clear. But at any rate, these two angels are actually referred to respectively as the Great Seal and the fearsome crown. So again, here we have the angels functioning as the Great Seal and the fearsome crown. And then once you complete this 12-day cycle of fasting and adjurations, one will have adjured the Sar Torah. It never tells us how exactly this happens, right? It never says the Sar Torah will show up and he'll look like so-and-so. There's just some sense in which he'll show up, they'll show up, the Sar Torah will show up. And what do you get? Well, obviously you get rabbinical knowledge. That's the whole point of all of this, is you get rabbinical knowledge without having to study. You get a vision of the chariot. So you do get the goal of the Merkavah Mysticism. You do achieve a vision of the chariot. But even more mundane things, you are ushered away from grief. You're ushered away from pain. And in some sense, it says you will renew the traditions as if they were in the days of old. And so you will be able to reestablish the Mazara, the true traditions of, one presumed, Judaism, in such a way as it was in the days of old. So this is basically the praxis. And the praxis, of course, looks very much like the Merkavah praxis that we've already seen, because in some sense, the Merkavah praxis is probably based on a retooling, a remixing of the praxis of the Sar Torah. Now, what's further known is that they're wondering just how effective this is. And at the end, toward the end of the text, we learned that Akiva does the Sar Torah and it works. But that's not terribly impressive. Akiva already has all this knowledge, right? Of course, Akiva is one of the most famous rabbis in history. So who cares if he learns a bunch of new Torah? Well, they say, let's try it on some person who doesn't know any Torah. So they try it on an illiterate person. Now, how they convinced an illiterate person to do this to themselves, I don't know. Seems like people who are unlearned shepherds would be like, I'm not staying in a room by myself for 12 days and doing all this. I don't even want to know all this stuff. At any rate, they duped a couple of people. They duped an unlearned person and a shepherd, right? So classic Amha people, right? Classic people who, at least according to the rabbinical literature, are lesser than. They're not scrupulous. They're not learned. But they do it, and pop, it worked. It works. So it works even for the unlearned. It works even for shepherds. And they even take Akiva, goes all the way to Babylon, into a impure land, into a land that's foreign to Eretz Israel, and he tries it there, and it works there as well. Now, why Akiva is doing this like twice is not clear to me. I don't know what the point of doing it twice is, but he tries it in the land of Babylon, and it works there as well. And that might give us some clue, perhaps, as to where the text was written down. Now, a couple things at the very end of the text. What we have is that there are two adjurations at the very end of the Sar Torah literature that seem to be sort of prayers to the Sar Torah themselves. And I think, and I'm not sure about this, but those may be the midrash of the Sar Torah that the text says that you have to insert into your daily prayers during the 12-day cycle of fasting and all the sort of things you have to do in order to achieve this. So this is where we have the Sar Torah literature and the way that it works, and the kind of things that will go on here. Now, a couple of things that are worth mentioning here is that none of the danger is recounted in this text. One has a sense that if you just do it, it'll work. There's a kind of mechanical nature to it. And notice also, it doesn't say you have to be righteous, you have to be pious, you have to be learned. In fact, it's precisely to do the learning, right? So you don't have to be terribly learned. Shepherds and illiterate people did it. So there's no qualifications whatsoever in order to begin the praxis. You just have to be able to isolate yourself for 12 days, sequester yourself, and make your own bread, etc. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, of course, is that there is no sense that there's danger involved. You simply do it, and mechanically the Sar Torah shows up. There's a kind of compulsion aspect to it. You don't have to go through a whole bunch of terrible ordeals. There's no water ordeal. There's no angels throwing you on axes. You sequester yourself. You do it. You get a vision of the chariot. So one might wonder, if you can just do this and get a vision of the chariot at the throne of God, the Merkavah, why do all the other stuff? Why do all of that? If the Sar Torah gets you that anyway, why do all the stuff that's going to get you killed? unless there's some kind of blind here, right? Unless we're dealing with a magical blind of some kind. But you'll notice this text feels a lot more magical, right? There is a story that affirms how great all magical texts do the same thing, right? This is such a great magical. This book is so powerful it came from Noah or something. So the book affirms its own power, right? It writes its own story, and then further, it's mechanical. You do it, the angel shows up, you get the stuff. Unlike the Merkavah mysticism, which is not at all mechanical. You have to be very careful. You have to meet all these qualifying situations to make the descent. And then once you make the descent, you have to do all kinds of things in order to get, you have these ordeals and these angels and all this. Notice that these two texts, again, are not the same. The Merkavah literature is full of ordeals. It is not at all mechanical. This text, no ordeals, very mechanical. So again, how these texts fit together and exactly how they are talking to each other isn't clear. But it is clear that this is just tacked on to Hekhalot Rabbati, right? Probably because, as I said, this is the ground floor by which the praxis that became the Merkavah praxis is actually developed. So it may have its origins in a purely magical literature, but was sort of retrofitted or retconned to serve in this literature as well. So I think this text has its origins outside of the Merkavah literature. I don't think that it is native to the Merkavah literature. I think they have been stitched together at some point, and we don't know exactly when because we don't know anything about this literature. But I think that there are two distinct streams of Jewish magic, Jewish mysticism, Jewish esotericism that have at some point been welded together. Further, you'll probably know that there are a great many texts like this in the PGM. The PGM has lots of texts where you summon supernatural beings in order to get secrets. That's a very common motif in the Greek magical papyri, and in many ways, this text reads a lot like the Mithras liturgy to me. So now, again, is it from the same literature? I don't know, but are all that literature kind of pulling out of the same magical well? I would surmise. So. And as I mentioned, right, it doesn't exactly internally cohere with the other Merkavah mysticism, but I do believe, and I do think an argument can be made that the Sar Torah literature may be something like the proto versions of what becomes the Ars Notoria, which you may know that the Ars Notoria is a medieval mechanism of magic by which one gazes at what are called noti. You see one of them on the screen. You gaze at these noti, and angels are said to convey knowledge to you instantaneously. And so again, we have this idea that angels are conveying knowledge to you through some kind of meditation technique. And these noti, by the way, are full of nomina barbara, some of which are from Hebrew and Arabic. And so this just looks like a very similar kind of magic, even if they're not genetically related, right? Even there's no genetic relation, there is some similarity in terms of there's some at least parallel. They're homologous if they're not genetically related. And also, I think that we should mention here the Abramelin ritual. And the Abramelin ritual also is a ritual that requires one to sequester oneself and then undergo all kinds of prayers through a specific period of time, such that an angel will appear and give you some information, right? It'll become your holy guardian angel and bequeath to you some kind of information. So I think that we may be seeing in the Sar Torah literature a kind of early great grandparent of something like what became the Ars Notoria literature and the Abramelin ritual, which of course have come less so the Ars Notoria, but much more so the Abramelin has become a mainstay, one of the most important rituals in contemporary occultism, following especially the achievement of that ritual by Aleister Crowley, the popularization of it, and things like that. So again, this is a place where I think this literature is pointing us in the direction of important aspects of what became Western magic. Now, the Sar Torah is, again, as I mentioned, is associated with the revelation of another extremely bizarre piece of literature. In fact, I would even argue the most bizarre piece of literature in Jewish history. So bizarre that in many ways it would spawn response and counter-response in a way that I think really was a very productive. In some ways, if you want to just be productive, sometimes just write something so outrageous that people have to respond. and it will generate an entire literature, and you'll be to blame for it. But at any rate, this is the literature of the Shi'ur Qomah, which means something like the measure of the stature. And this literature, as you probably know, we've introduced it a little bit already. This literature will, shockingly, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of most people, will measure the divine body. It will name the various divine body parts with nomina barbara. And the achievement of this, the studying of this, will allow people to have various boons, as we'll talk about in a bit. But at any rate, the Shi'ur Qomah, at least as it appears, and it also exists independently, but as it appears in the Merkavah literature, it occurs at Merkavah Rabbah, Synopsis 688 to 94. And what we have is Rabbi Ishmael is actually in the descent. He's descended. So he is inside the world of the Merkavah, and he's seeking a vision of the divine stature. He wants to see the divine body. And in most cases, the Merkavah Mysticism, as we've talked about, does not allow for that. You never see descriptions of the divine body. You see maybe the king, you maybe sees aspects of it, but we never get sort of, this is what God looks like. This is what God's, I don't know, clothes look like, or something like that. With the exception of Hekhalot Rabati, we do get a sense of God's clothes with his beautiful constellation robe that he wears. But at any rate, Rabbi Ishmael is seeking a vision of the divine stature, and he's seeking it from the Sar Torah. So the Sar Torah is there in the Merkavah. Rabbi Ishmael is like, I want to see the divine stature. And so the Sar Torah says, all right, I'll give you a vision of the stature of the divine body. Now, this is a vision within a vision, folks. This is like Inception. Like, it's like a dream within a dream. So now we're getting meta visions. So within the Merkavah vision, he is now given a further vision. The Sar Torah induces in him a further vision, and in that further vision, he sees God sitting on the throne. This is one of the only times in the literature someone claims to see God. So he sees the divine sitting on the throne, and to the left of the throne, there's another entity attending to God. And this entity is referred to as the Prince of the Present Spirit, a Ruach. Not an angel, but a Ruach. Now, this is, again, one of the only times we've heard about a Ruach being in this world. Almost always, these are angels. But this entity is very clearly distinguished as being not. Now, we do know of other entities called like the Sarpanim, the angel of the countenance. And that angel is an angel, but this entity is not. This entity is a spirit, a Ruach. Now, what exactly that means and why this entity is seated directly to the left of the divine throne is not clear. But then that spirit reveals a specific name of God, and that's a very specific name of God, which I put into the left of the screen. And I'll talk about it in a second. It's a very weird, elaborate name of God. And when you utter that elaborate name of God, that further induces a third vision. So we're now 3 visions deep, and that third vision is a vision in which one sees the divine countenance. Now, again, you can see this, and I saw the holy name, and the blessed be the name, and you can see the name here, Yahu Hai Hava Adonai Ya 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 Yahu Yahu Yaha Ya. It sounds like glossolalia. These are permutations of the Yod He Vav He, right? The name, the divine name in Hebrew. And I mean, some of them here, right? Who. It just goes on and on and on, right? This is the name, right? That one is given, right? And here you can see Kol. This is the name. It is the strangest name for God in the literature that I know of. I forget exactly how long this goes. I mean, this is the entire one, but theoretically, once one utters this name out loud, while you're inside of the vision of the Merkavah, and inside of the vision of the Merkavah, you're inside of the vision where you see the Prince of the Present Spirit, that will induce the third vision, and that third vision is the vision of the Shi'ur Qomah. So again, 3 deep visions. And then what follows is, again, as I said, it's the most shocking text in Jewish history. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, it was so shocking that Maimonides basically said a Jew couldn't have written it. A Jew did not write this. It's so shocking. And what is it? It is a part-by-part description of the divine body measured in the Persian unit, the parasang, and it details specific names for many parts of the divine body, beginning at the feet, going up to the shoulders, then describing the divine head, and then down to the divine fingers. And it's very strange. For instance, God doesn't have toes. God has fingers on God's feet, specifically 3 of them. Right? The corporality is not only vast, but it is unusual. God's head is massive compared to God's body. The head is some like 3 times bigger than the divine body. So it gets this. If you do the sort of the math on this, it becomes the image that it produces is extraordinarily weird. And I just give one here, of course, God's beard. And yes, I should mention here the divine genitals are not mentioned. So you would think that you get something about God's genitals, but they are skipped over. But God's beard, I just, to pick a non-arbitrary thing, we all think of God as being bearded, I suppose. But God's beard is 118 myriad and 500,000 parasangs. So it's just absolutely massive. And we get the name of God's beard. And so again, how to pronounce this, Zakas. I mean, again, exactly how one pronounces this is not clear. Although Davila does point out that this right here, this hudro, might be the word water. This may be the Greek word water hiding inside of here. Now, what this other part is not clear, but it could be the Greek word water, but it also could be anything. We don't know exactly. At any rate, this is just a classic example of the text. So again, you have God's beard, you have a huge number for how big it is, and then you have the nomina barbara for it as well. So exactly, again, what's going on here is not clear, but the text goes on and on and on like this. Now, this text, as you can imagine, this is my favorite picture in the Sistine Chapel, by the way, where you can see God's butt. It does not describe God's butt. But I don't know if anyone has been in there before, but I like going in there and being like, it's hilarious. That can you imagine him laying on his back painting God's rear end? I mean, there's just something about that moment where you're like, and how long did he spend on God's rear end? Like this, what a hilarious, of all the parts of God, right? You can see, we always imagine the famous image of Adam and God touching fingers. We never ever see the fact that God's like, mooning us. One hopes that he's just like, it's really a sense of humor here. But at any rate, we typically think of Judaism as being an incredibly aniconic religion, that it is deeply allergic to representations of the divine body. Even the idea of that God has a body has become anathema in the Jewish imagination. But I want to point out here, the Shi'ur Qomah literature is not without precedent. And what is that precedent? That precedent is the Bible. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is always describing the body of God. God's face, God's hands, God's legs. God walks through the Garden of Eden in the cool of the evening. And this is a point that has been made very well by scholars like Francesca Stavrakopoulou, where the Israelites imagined their God like everyone else, and they all imagine their God as embodied. And so, in many ways, the Shi'ur Qomah shocks us, but I think to an Israelite, this would have been a very, maybe not normal document, but it would have been an imaginable document. And so again, I think we have to it's shocking to us because of how Judaism has developed, but I think that it stands in continuity with the divine as the divine is spelled out in a more literal sense in the studies of the divine in the Hebrew Bible. Now, what you'll get, right, is in this study, if you study this great mystery, this Raza Gadola, if you study this mystery, you get all kinds of things. And I will say that having studied it, I've become physically beautiful and I have a good name in Israel. But no, I don't. At any rate, what you are said to achieve if you study this mystery is that you become physically beautiful. You get tall, which is interesting, right? The idea that you get taller. Just imagine you send your husband away, to the yeshiva. He's 5'8" and comes back 6'2". And you're like, what have you been doing? I've been studying the Shi'ur Qomah. So you become physically beautiful. You become taller. You acquire a good name in Israel. You have good dreams, which again, that's not nothing. You don't forget your Torah learning, which is again a concern that we see a lot in Merkavah literature. A lot of the texts actually have to do with the fact that they In fact, in many cases, the texts are written because one of the rabbis can't remember his Torah, and they need to have some kind of trick to help with their memory, and so this helps with gaining Torah learning. You gain forgiveness of sins, which again is a relatively unusual thing in Judaism. Typically, you can't study something and have your sins forgiven. You have to actually atone for them in the sense of for Yom Kippur stuff. The evil inclination loses its power over you. So the Yetzer Hara, which typically has some degree of power over us, the Yetzer Hara becomes unable to affect you. You cannot be assaulted by spirits or demons or robbers or injurious animals like scorpions. So it's a great system of pest control. And also you achieve merit both in this world and in the world to come. So this is another place, a rare place in the literature where one is given access to the world to come via having studied this literature. So not a bad haul, all things told, for studying what is apparently just 3 or 4 pages of a relatively unusual text. Now, on the one hand, this is a text that is very unlike Merkavah mysticism, in that it seems like typically in the Merkavah text we do not get a physical description of God. In Hekhalot Rabbati, we just engage in the union, or like the sacred union with the angels singing around the throne of God. We don't see God. We see the throne, but not God. Here we not only see God, but measure God. And in this case, this text, while it's unusual in the Merkavah literature, it makes sense as a logical extension. Because if you're looking at the throne of God, you're going to see God. Right? You're going to see God, logically speaking. If God is on the throne, therefore you will see God. And the question is, what does this being look like? Now, what's interesting is that in the Shi'ur Qomah literature, God is never described as seated. God is described as standing, right? And so the question is, what is the relationship of the standing to the throne literature, right? Because typically you see a throne, you see someone sitting on it, you don't see someone standing in front of it. But it's, again, more paradoxes to make this literature all the more unusual. Now, I'll make the controversial argument here that the Shi'ur Qomah may have given rise to the Kabbalah as we know it, although indirectly. Now, Menachem Kellner, who's written a fantastic book about this, has argued that Maimonides' famous book, The God That Perplexed, is actually a direct response to this mystical vision. Because if you've ever read The God That Perplexed, especially the first part of The God That Perplexed, that entire book is dedicated to one task. And it is tedious in the extreme. With all due respect to the great eagle, it is a tedious text because what Maimonides does is goes over every major part of the Bible where God is described in physical terms and shows how, in fact, it's a metaphor. What Maimonides is concerned about in the first section of The God That Perplexed is that no one believed God has a body. And that when the Torah or the Tanakh describes God having a body, those are all metaphors. And Maimonides goes all the way to tell you exactly in what way the metaphor should be understood. Because if you believe God has a body, that absolutely undoes your ability to achieve the world to come. It is for Maimonides the worst possible sin. It is a nightmarish sin because it violates to him the first commandment. Right? No graven images, because God cannot be represented. And so it violates the first commandment, which in many ways Maimonides thinks is one of the more important ones, and therefore it eliminates your share in the world to come. Why write a book if, especially as exhausted as he is with doing it, right, if this is not going on? And we'll see in a minute that he believes that it is. And again, the Mora Nevuchim, the God That Perplexed is obsessed with undoing any ideas that God has a body, and also undoing any ideas about Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah as forms of mysticism. Maimonides will argue that Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah are simply Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian metaphysics, and anything more than that is, according to Maimonides, incorrect. Maybe even worse than incorrect. So notice what he's done. He's directly engaged with combating, at least indirectly, the Shi'ur Qomah literature by saying, absolutely, God does not have a body, and here are the correct ways of metaphorically understanding God's body. And further, Maaseh Merkavah and Maaseh Bereshit are not forms of mysticism. They are simply Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. So Menachem Kellner has argued, right, that he is directly dealing, right, with this literature. And he's dealing with it by using the Guide of the Perplexed as a means of polemicizing against it. I'm relatively convinced by Kellner's argument. Also, prophecy is subjugated to Aristotelian active intellect stuff. And further, by the way, angels are reduced from this myriad of angels to exactly 9. For Maimonides, there are 9 and only 9 angels, and that's it. That's it. That's all that exists. So all these angels, this profusion of crazy angels we have in this literature, are utterly reduced to 9. And that's all that is said to exist. And what's interesting, this is very interesting, is in the Cairo Geniza, a copy of a fragment of the Shi'ur Qomah has been found. And that fragment has scribbles in it, notations in it, that look like the handwriting of Maimonides. So I think we do, right? We do have the idea, we do have a text that looks like it's written in Maimonides is a very distinct hand, and we have his autograph too, by the way, in the Cairo Geniza. It's very weird to sit. I've seen it just to look at Maimonides' signature. It just doesn't seem possible that something like that would exist. But at any rate, Maimonides seems to have the text, and it even has in the text curses for anyone that believes that it. So it says if you read this, you're to be cursed. And he even says that there was a responsa. Someone wrote to Maimonides saying, "What do you think about this book?" And he says that if it's found, it should be burned, which is an ironic thing considering what's going to happen to Maimonides' books, right? So he says if you find it, you should burn it. And he even says in that responsa that the text was written by the Edomites. It wasn't even a Jewish text. It was written by Christians. But it was Edomites that wrote it. So Maimonides finds the Shi'ur Qomah text so horrifying that not only does it make it a heretical Jewish text, he says it's not even written by Jews. It was written by Edomites, Christians. Now, of course, no Christian's going to write this either. It's written in Hebrew. I mean, there's a ridiculous claim to think that it was written by Christians. But this just shows you how horrifying this text was to Maimonides. And if Menachem Kellner's right, then the Guide of the Perplexed is in fact the response to Shi'ur Qomah mysticism, which is again an outgrowth, perhaps, or parallel to the mysticism of the Maaseh Merkavah. Now, this sentiment that God has no body is like now built into the very architecture of Jewish prayer, right? If you've ever gone to a Jewish prayer service, you will end that service, at least on Saturday mornings, with Yigdal, right? With Yigdal. And one of the things that we say, and it's a very distinctly Aristotelian piece of poetry, but what does it say, right? Ein lo demut haguf ve'eno guf, right? God has no body, nor even the appearance of a body. In fact, it is impossible to measure his holiness. Right? Right? The text is very clearly saying God has no body, God doesn't have the appearance of a body, and there is no way to measure God's holiness. It's inconceivable to my mind that the writer of Yigdal, which is, again, a very Maimonidean poem, right? But it is clearly polemicizing against Shi'ur Qomah. No body, not even the appearance of a body, right? And not in God's measurement, God's holiness cannot be measured, because that's exactly what the Shi'ur Qomah is doing. God has a body, God's body looks like our body, and we can measure it. And so if you've ever been to a service and sang Yigdal, you have polemicized, I think, against the Shi'ur Qomah literature. Now, this is interesting, because remember what's also in the Jewish liturgy. Other Merkavah poems. Inside of Jewish liturgy, hiding inside of the world of Jewish liturgy, is both a form of mysticism and its opponent. It's schizophrenically lovely, where we have both Merkavah literature and anti-Merkavah literature hiding in the liturgy. There is a conversation about this mysticism happening in prayer, and most Jews have never seen it. have no realization that what's going on, right, is that this is going on in the very daily prayer life of a Jew, where they're polemicizing and anti-polemicizing about a form of mysticism that has not been practiced in 800 years. But it's built into the Jewish prayer life. By the way, this is a draft copy in Maimonides' hand. It's in Judeo-Arabic, but you're looking at a copy of the Cairo Geniza. This is a draft copy of the Guide to the Perplexed in Maimonides' hand. So again, really a treasure that has been discovered there in the text. So how does this give rise, in my opinion, to the Kabbalah? Well, the hardcore version of Maimonideanism faced a reaction primarily in France and Spain. The Maimonideans faced off against the anti-Maimonideans. The anti-Maimonideans were hyper-traditionalists, and they were mystics. And what did they do? They formed a form of Jewish mysticism that said, hey, Maimonides says we can't talk about God's body. You know what we're going to do? We're going to make God's body the very center of that mysticism. And what is the name of God's body in that form of mysticism? The Sefirot. The Sefirot are God's body. And where does that get developed? It gets developed in the Sefer Zohar. The Sefer Zohar is in many ways anti-Maimonides. It says, not only can we talk about God's body, but meditating and repairing God's body is at the center of Jewish mysticism, and it is the very point of halakha. The point of halakha, the point of Jewish life is the being a chiropractor for God's body. It is realigning the divine body. And you do that through the mitzvot, and you realign the sefirot through doing the mitzvot, tikkun olam, which will become tikkun olam in the Kabbalah of the Arizal. And in fact, if you've ever had the opportunity or the danger of studying the Sefer Zohar, you will know that the most esoteric parts of the Sefer Zohar are primarily concerned with what? The exact nature of the God, the divine body, specifically the divine head, the divine brain, and the various juices that flow from the divine brain into the divine beard and all the different kinds of hairs that are on the divine beard and the divine skull. And if you've ever seen these very strange images from Kabbalah Denudata, that's what they're talking about. That's what we're talking about. These channels coming from God's brain going into God's hairs and God's beard. Those are illustrations from Norvin Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata of describing, visually showing these most obscure sections of the Sefer Zohar, like the Sifra Din Sniuta. So what we see is that the classic Freudian return of the repressed. The Shi'ur Qomah says, God has a body, we can measure it. Maimonides says, how dare you? You can't do that. That's heretical. Don't do that. And so some of them didn't do it. Then what happens later? The reaction. And what is the reaction? The reaction is Kabbalah. And as we'll see at the very end of our lecture series, what we'll see is that this will win. Maimonides will win halakhically. The Kabbalists will win mystically. And Judaism gets on getting on, right? Because in Kabbalah, all of this exotic Merkavah literature will survive, right? All this speculation about the divine body will survive, but in the halakhic world, ultimately, Maimonides will win the day. Now, you would think that given this, again, you think about a poem like Yigdal, where we say, literally out loud, singing, God has no body, God has no semblance of a body, etc., that a text like Shi'ur Qomah would be absolutely written out of Jewish history. That didn't happen. Shi'ur Qomah continued to be printed and continued to be copied in manuscript on its own, right? And in Merkavah literature. It was even known to Christians. We know of a 9th century bishop of Lyon. He's actually an Anglo-Saxon dude named Agobard. And he even says the Jews believe that God has a body and it's like this. And they have it in one of their terrible texts. So even a non-Jew knew that Jews were reading and studying this text by the 9th century in Europe. In Europe, right? This is already being known in Europe. And so Shi'ur Qomah continues to be printed. In fact, a version of Shi'ur Qomah is actually in the Summa Sacra Magici, in the 14th century manual of magic, perhaps the most important manual of magic produced in Europe. The section that Dr. Skinner has translated, it's not in that section. It's one of the later sections. It'll be in the second volume of his edition. It's in the German manuscript. But so we know that Christian magicians were interested in this because, again, Summa Sacra Magica is meant to be the one-stop shop for all things magical. When Ganel wrote it, Ganel felt that the Shi'ur Qomah was important enough to include in what he took to be the definitive book of magic in Europe. The definitive book of magic. So it clearly was important enough to him to have translated from Hebrew Aramaic into Latin, and it would be continue to be printed in Jewish circles all the way down to this day. I walked into a bookstore in Brooklyn and bought a copy. Right? So it is on the shelf, a book that, to my mind, is shocking in its in its idea. Now, how do Jewish people deal with this? They say, well, it's a metaphor, or it's a mystical body, right? It's not a physical body, it's a mystical body. And these units of measurement, they're so huge that they're not meant to be thought of as literal numbers, but as objects of contemplation. That it is a kind of astral body that you project and think about in your mind as a way of meditating, as a meditative behavior, not as the actual body of God. But the centrality of this text cannot be denied. In fact, in the most important work of Kabbalah Ma'asit, of practical Kabbalah, the Sefer Razio HaMalach, it's printed inside that book as well. Which I think what I would argue by the 18th century, the Sefer Razio became the most important book of Jewish magic, and it's included in that book along with the Sefer Malbush and other kinds of books as well. It's all included in the Sefer Razio, of which there's no good translation, sadly. But rather than being condemned as heretical, what you think there couldn't be anything more heretical than this book. I mean, literally, there are songs in Jewish liturgy about God not having a body, and yet it became a Kabbalistic classic. Printed and reprinted. There's versions. Cordovero wrote a commentary on it. Sadia Gaon knew about it. No one seems to ultimately have decided, with the exception of Maimonides, that this book should be destroyed. And even his argument that it should be destroyed spawned Kabbalah in some ways. So this is a place, again, where we think of the Merkavah mysticism as being totally forgotten in the Jewish world. And yet, I would argue, it survived. Here it is being printed in the 19th century, as in a 19th century edition, right? And it's been printed over and over again, like I said, in Sefer Raziel and other kinds of text. It appears in Christian mystical and magical literature. And so this text is otherwise so unusual, has had a history all of its own. And this intersection of Merkavah mysticism and magic, right? We see it in Ganel, we see it in Sefer Raziel, we see it in other kinds of texts. That intersection, I think, has been conspicuous throughout the entire class. We've not said a lot about it. But with next week, we will show how Merkavah mysticism, including the Sar Torah, including Shi'ur Qomah, how all this literature intersects the world of ancient magic. And it is to that conversation we'll come back to next week as we situate this literature within the wider world of the magical praxes of the days in which it was produced.